You've been singing Let It Go Wrong. Not the notes, not the words, the meaning. For 12 years, you've sung it as a victory song, at karaoke bars, in elementary school talent shows, in the cars of women who just left bad relationships, in the headphones of teenagers who had finally told their parents who they actually were. 12 years of Let It Go as the sound of freedom, as the anthem of becoming yourself, as Disney's great progressive gesture. Look, they made a princess movie about self-acceptance. They made a princess movie for people who were never going to fit the mold. They made a princess movie that didn't end with a wedding. They didn't. Here's what they actually made. A film about a child who was taught by the people who loved her most that her authentic self was dangerous. A film about what that teaching does to a person over decades of enforced performance. A film about the moment that performance catastrophically fails, not because the person breaks free, but because they break down. And Let It Go, the song, the one with 1 billion YouTube views, the one that parents still beg their children to stop singing in the grocery store, the one that LGBTQ+ teenagers played in their bedrooms at 2 a.m. when the weight of hiding became physically unbearable. That song is not the liberation. That song is the crisis. Nobody wants to hear this, I understand. The song is so effective as an anthem that reading it as something else feels like an act of vandalism, like arguing that a flag doesn't mean what people think it means after they've already died for it. But intent and impact are different things, and what a song means to people in their lives and what a song means within the logic of the film it comes from are very different arguments. I'm making the second one, and once you see it, the film becomes more interesting than you ever thought it was, and more disturbing. Here is the conventional reading of Frozen, which is approximately correct as a surface summary. Two sisters, separated by Elsa's uncontrollable ice powers, are reunited when Elsa accidentally plunges their kingdom of Arendelle into eternal winter. Anna sets out to find her sister, is betrayed by her fiancé Hans, who turns out to be a villain, nearly dies, is saved by the act of true love between sisters, and the kingdom is restored. Elsa learns to control her powers through love. The end. The feminist message, true love doesn't require a man. Sisterhood saves the day. Women don't need rescuing. Critics celebrated this. Academics analyzed it through feminist theory. Parents praised it. The LGBTQ+ community adopted Elsa. The disability rights community adopted Let It Go. Sociologists wrote papers about how Frozen was evidence of Disney's progressive evolution. Box office, $128 billion. Oscar, Best Animated Feature. Cultural penetration, total, sustained, arguably unmatched by any animated film since The Lion King. Now here is the reading that the film actually earns if you watch it clinically, without the culture's preloaded interpretation attached to every frame. Frozen is a film about what happens to a person when trusted authority figures respond to difference, not with understanding, but with management. It is a film in which a child's authentic selfhood is systematically dismantled in the name of safety, not maliciously, but with love. It is a film in which the protocol designed to protect that child instead creates the very catastrophe it was built to prevent. It is a film in which the liberation sequence is, structurally and lyrically, a dissociation episode rather than a breakthrough. And it is a film whose ending, universally described as happy, resolves almost nothing for the protagonist, while encoding her into a permanently managed existence. The film's true villains are not Hans. Hans is just a selfish man. The film identifies him as the villain in the third act and dispatches him accordingly. He's a red herring, a distraction. The film plants him so you'll have somewhere to direct your anger, somewhere other than at the people who actually built the conditions for Arendelle's catastrophe. The film's true villains are the trolls. Stay with me. The trolls? The small, mossy rock creatures led by Grand Pavi appear twice in Frozen. Their first appearance in the film's opening act is the scene that everyone treats as a plot mechanism, a magical exposition dump, a moment of world building. It is actually the most important scene in the entire film. It is the moment where an authority figure looks at a traumatized child who has just accidentally hurt her sister and says, the solution is not to understand this child's power, but to teach her to hide it. Not to integrate it, not to normalize it, not to build systems that accommodate her difference, to conceal it, to suppress the feelings that accompany it, to perform normalcy at the cost of authentic experience. Conceal it. Don't feel it. Don't let it show. The film gives these words to the king, but Grandpappy planted them. The king received a strategy from an authority he trusted, a magical elder, an ancient wisdom figure, and that strategy was, clinically speaking, the worst possible intervention for a child presenting with uncontrollable difference tied to emotional states. And then the parents died, leaving Elsa to execute that strategy alone without support for years. This is not a story about a woman learning to be free. This is a story about a woman who was never given the conditions to develop a self in the first place, and what the implosion of that developmental failure looks like. Let it go is not freedom. Let it go is what happens when a pressure vessel finally cracks. Here's why this matters, and it matters beyond film criticism. Frozen was consumed by millions of people, particularly young people, who were themselves navigating various forms of managed identity. Gay teenagers, autistic children, young women with anxiety disorders, neurodivergent kids who had been told, explicitly or through the accumulated weight of social feedback, to hide the parts of themselves that made other people uncomfortable. These people found Frozen, and they found Elsa, and they used the film's emotional architecture as a mirror. That's valid. That's what art does. That's good. But the mirror they found was not a mirror of liberation. It was a mirror of their own suppression, and the culture handed them the suppression story and told them it was an empowerment narrative. Which means that the actual thing Frozen depicts, the diagnostic precision with which it portrays coercive identity management and its consequences, went largely unexamined. While everyone was celebrating the outcome, nobody was interrogating the system that produced it. The evidence for this reading is not hidden. It is not a matter of reading between lines or applying theoretical frameworks that the film couldn't have intended. It is in the text, in the songs, in the visual architecture, in the blocking and the color palette, and the structural logic of every scene that everyone already knows by heart. The film is arguing something precise and uncomfortable, and we have been singing over it for 12 years. That ends now. Watch what happens when you stop hearing "Let It Go" as triumph and start hearing it as the clinical record of a person coming apart. Watch what happens when you stop seeing Elsa's ice palace as a home she built for herself and start seeing it as the most elaborate avoidance mechanism ever constructed in CGI. Watch what happens when you count how many times this film returns to the image of a door, closed, locked, slammed, frozen shut, and ask yourself, what kind of liberation story keeps returning obsessively to barriers? The kind that isn't actually about liberation. The kind that is actually about the construction of barriers so thorough and so early that when they finally fail, the person inside doesn't walk out into freedom. She walks out into a blizzard she caused and can't yet control, and then builds herself a new and more beautiful cage, higher up and harder to reach. Here's the argument, as simply as I can put it. Frozen is not about learning to be free. It is about learning what was done to you. And the film stops one step short of that, which is why its ending feels slightly off even to people who love it. It stops at the threshold of recognition. It lets Elsa feel love rather than feel rage. And in that substitution, it performs exactly the same operation the trolls performed in Act 1. It offers the protagonist emotional resolution without political clarity. It resolves the symptoms without naming the disease. The disease has a name, we'll get to it. But first, Let's look at the evidence. The trolls are the villains. Let me prove it. You've seen the opening of Frozen a dozen times. You probably think it's about establishing Elsa's powers and setting up the plot. It's not. It's a scene about institutional response to difference, and it gets that response definitively, catastrophically wrong. Young Elsa has accidentally hurt young Anna while they were playing. They were playing, remember that? Not because Elsa was being careless or malicious. They were playing two children, one of whom had a power she didn't fully understand yet, engaged in exactly the kind of joyful, uninhibited exploration that is supposed to be the developmental right of childhood. And then Anna was hurt. The parents rushed them to the trolls. Grandpappy examines Anna and delivers his assessment. The damage was to Anna's mind, not her heart, so it can be fixed. He removes Anna's memories of Elsa's magic. But leave the fun, he says, because he is, on some level, actually trying to be helpful. Then he turns to Elsa, to the child who is traumatized and frightened and clearly blaming herself for what happened, and he delivers his verdict. Born with the powers or cursed. Look at the binary he offers, born with it or cursed by it. Not, this is a gift that needs cultivation. Not, this is a difference that needs accommodation. Not, let's figure out how this child can exist in the world as she is. The frame is already damage assessment. The framing is already pathological. And then he says, fear will be her enemy. What's the prescription? Not teach her to understand her power, so fear doesn't dominate her experience of it. Not create conditions of safety around her so her emotional states can be explored without catastrophic consequence. The prescription is teach her not to feel the fear. Conceal it. Don't feel it. Don't let it show. The king takes this advice from a magical authority figure he trusts and builds his entire parenting strategy around it. He brings in gloves to suppress Elsa's physical connection to her power. He closes the castle gates. He locks the doors. He reduces the family's world to a series of managed, controlled, contained spaces. And he tells his daughter repeatedly, lovingly, in the song she sings with him, to suppress not her power specifically, but her feelings. Because it is the feelings that activate the power. This is the film's central diagnostic insight, and it deserves to be stated plainly. Elsa is not taught to manage her power. She is taught to suppress her emotional experience. These are not the same thing. Managing a power requires understanding it. Suppressing emotional experience requires dismantling the self that generates those emotions. The troll's prescription isn't a strategy for coexistence with difference. It's a strategy for the erasure of interior life. And it doesn't work. Of course it doesn't work, because it can't work. You cannot suppress the emotions of a developing child without consequences that eventually exceed the original problem. The pressure doesn't disappear. It accumulates. Here's what nobody discusses about this scene. Grandpappy, presented as a wisdom figure, prescribes the one intervention that developmental psychology consistently identifies as harmful for children presenting with anxiety-linked difference. He prescribes suppression. And the film frames his prescription as the best available option under difficult circumstances, which it might have been given the limited magical tools at his disposal, while simultaneously constructing the entire narrative around the catastrophic consequences of following it. The film knows the trolls are wrong. It encodes that knowledge in every subsequent scene, but it never names them as wrong. It lets them off the hook, and then it brings them back in Act 3 for a second assault. We'll get there. The locked door sequence. Do you want to build a snowman? Before we discuss what this song is, let's establish what it has been sold as: a heartbreaking montage of sisterly separation, years passing, Anna growing up lonely while Elsa struggles inside her room, a technically brilliant piece of emotional storytelling, a song that makes grown adults cry. All of that is true, and none of it is the point. The point is the door. Count the doors in Frozen. I'll give you a partial list. The castle gates close at the film's beginning, after the troll scene. Elsa's bedroom door is locked. The Great Hall doors stay closed. The gates to Arendelle are shut for years. The door to Elsa's room during "Do You Want to Build a Snowman?" is never opened. After her parents die, Elsa does not open her door. At the coronation, she opens the doors for one day and disaster follows. When she flees, she slams the door of the castle behind her. At her ice palace, which she builds herself, which is supposedly her liberation, the establishing visual is her closing the door. The film is obsessed with doors because it is a film about enclosure. And the doors that close around Elsa are not built by villains. They are built by her parents with love, on the advice of the trolls, with the best intentions anyone has ever had while doing irreversible psychological damage to a child. Do you want to build a snowman? Is not primarily a song about Anna's loneliness, though it is also that. It is a song about the enactment of the management protocol. Watch it with that frame. Anna comes to Elsa's door, not once, repeatedly, across years, across developmental stages, across the grief of her parents' deaths. She knocks, she pleads, she tries humor, she tries vulnerability. She tries everything a child can try when separated from the person she loves most by a barrier she doesn't understand. She grows up on the wrong side of a door that Elsa has been instructed to keep closed, and Elsa, on the other side of that door, is doing the same thing in reverse. She hears Anna. The film makes sure you know she hears Anna. In the reaction shots, in the way her hand almost touches the door handle, in the ice that forms on the door in response to her emotional distress, she is not cold to Anna. She is burning with the need to respond, and the protocol she has been given requires her to convert that burning into ice, to conceal it, to not feel it, to not let it show. Both children are suffering. One is suffering from loneliness. One is suffering from the enforced suppression of everything she is. The mechanism that causes both kinds of suffering is the same protocol, installed by the same authority figures, in the name of the same love. The film keeps coming back to this door because the door is its argument. Not a symbol of Elsa's isolation, exactly, though it is that. A symbol of what managed identity looks like from both sides. It isolates the person inside. It baffles the person outside, who can't understand why the door won't open, who doesn't know about the management protocol, who experiences the closure as rejection when it is actually its opposite. When Anna says to the closed door, in the most emotionally devastating line in the sequence, "Okay, bye," and you hear her voice crack with the resigned acceptance of a child who has learned to expect the door to stay closed, that's not just heartbreaking, that's the documentation of secondary damage. The trolls prescribed a protocol for one child's protection, and that protocol is visibly, audibly, precisely destroying a second child in the process. The death of the parents, abandonment in the grammar of love. The king and queen of Arendelle die in a shipwreck, off-screen, during a montage, while "Do You Want to Build a Snowman?" plays. It is handled quickly and efficiently, as befits a Disney film that needs to dispatch its parent characters and get to the actual narrative. The death is not dwelt upon. It should be. The parents leave. They go on a voyage, they die, and they leave behind two daughters, one locked in voluntary isolation, executing a management protocol that requires constant emotional vigilance, and one locked out, growing up essentially alone in a castle full of closed doors. The death is not incidental to the film's argument. The death is the narrative's final act of abandonment dressed as tragedy. I am not saying the parents intended to abandon their children by dying. Obviously not. I am saying that the film positions their death as the logical endpoint of the protocol they established. They built a management structure that was entirely dependent on their presence to sustain it, and then they removed themselves from the equation. Elsa is left not with the tools to understand and integrate her power, but with a protocol she now has to execute alone indefinitely, without support, without modeling, without the ongoing relationship that might have allowed the protocol to evolve. She is left with the instruction, but not the instructor. And what happens to a management protocol when the manager leaves and the managed person is still a teenager? The protocol calcifies. It becomes identity rather than strategy. Elsa stops performing suppression as a temporary measure until she figures out a better approach. She starts performing suppression as her permanent mode of being. The gloves stop being gloves and start being skin. This is the parent's real legacy, not the management protocol itself, which might have been revisited and revised under different circumstances, but the structural conditions that made revision impossible. They left. The protocol stayed. And the protocol, without human warmth and ongoing relationship to temper it, became something closer to imprisonment. The film mourns the parents with the cultural grammar of grief. It is genuinely sad when they die. But the film also, without quite naming it, encodes their death as the completion of a set of conditions under which catastrophe becomes inevitable. You cannot lock a pressure vessel, leave it unattended for years, and be surprised when it explodes. The parents, who loved their daughters genuinely and tried their best, did exactly that. The song everyone got backwards, let me be precise about what Let It Go actually depicts, because the gap between what it depicts and what it has been received as is the core of this entire argument. Elsa has just been exposed at her coronation. The ice she has spent years suppressing has broken through, not gradually, not controllably, but in a single catastrophic moment of emotional overwhelm. The suppression protocol has failed completely and publicly. She has, in the film's terms, revealed her secret, not chosen to reveal it, had it stripped from her by an accident of stress and emotion. She runs. She flees Arendelle. She runs toward a mountain where nobody can see her, touch her, or be hurt by her. And then she sings. Here are the actual lyrics, not the chorus, the actual content. A kingdom of isolation, and it looks like I'm the queen. Isolation as sovereignty, solitude as rule. She is not describing freedom in these lines. She is describing the logical outcome of the management protocol taken to its ultimate conclusion. If I am dangerous to others, then removing myself from others is the solution. She has internalized the management protocol so completely that escape into total isolation registers to her as liberation. Don't let them in, don't let them see. Be the good girl you always have to be. Conceal, don't feel, don't let them know. Well, now they know. Read those lyrics without the triumphant melody and tell me what they describe. They describe the internal monologue of a person who has spent her entire life performing a self she was prescribed rather than discovering a self that was actually hers. The good girl you always have to be. Not the good girl she wants to be or the good girl she is. The good girl she has to be. The management protocol isn't something Elsa chafes against or secretly rejects. She has absorbed it. She believes it. She thinks the management protocol is a moral requirement, not an institutional imposition. Let it go, let it go. Can't hold it back anymore. This is the line that everyone hears as liberation. I want you to hear it as description. She cannot hold it back anymore. This is not a choice. This is a failure of containment. The letting go is not volitional. She is not deciding to be free. She is experiencing the collapse of a structure that was never sustainable. You know what this sounds like clinically? It sounds like a dissociative episode following the failure of a long-term suppression strategy. The specific emotional signature, the relief, the sense of spaciousness, the feeling of finally not having to perform is well documented in psychological literature as a feature of dissociative states following chronic suppression. The relief is real. The relief is not the same as health. The relief is the body's response to the removal of an unbearable pressure. And the removal of that pressure came not through therapeutic intervention, but through catastrophic public failure and subsequent flight. Here I stand, and here I'll stay. Let the storm rage on. She's not saying she will be fine. She's saying she will not go back. There's a difference. The decision to never go back to a painful situation is not the same as the decision to build a functional life going forward. Elsa, in this song, does not make a decision about her future. She makes a decision about her past. She will not perform the protocol anymore. What she will do instead, she does not yet know. What she does instead is build a palace, alone, on a mountain. where nobody can reach her. The ice palace is staggeringly, breathtakingly beautiful, and it is a monument to avoidance. It is the management protocol's final form. The protocol said, hide. Elsa's palace says, I'll hide so completely, so elaborately, so beautifully that the hiding itself will look like sovereignty. The costume change that accompanies the song's climax is often read as Elsa discovering her authentic self. The formal coronation dress shed for something looser, more expressive, her hair let down, her body moving freely. And yes, on a surface level, that is liberation imagery. But look at what she builds herself, a palace with a single room, a location accessible only by those willing to climb a near vertical mountain, a home she immediately puts a door on. The film's most devastating recurring image, appearing again here in the scene supposedly about freedom. She closes the door to her own palace of liberation. The cold never bothered me anyway. This is the final line of the song, the triumphant kicker, the one delivered over the closed-door image. And I want you to listen to Idina Menzel's vocal delivery here, not the powerful belt that precedes it, but this line specifically. It's quieter, it's almost resigned. The melody drops slightly, it doesn't sound like triumph. It sounds like the thing you say when you've decided, finally, that the thing that hurt you isn't going to hurt you anymore, not because you've healed, but because you've decided to stop acknowledging the wound. The cold never bothered me anyway. She spent her entire life being told her coldness is dangerous and isolating. Her response to that is not to challenge the premise, not to argue that cold can be beautiful, that her power can be gift as well as danger, that the world might accommodate her difference rather than requiring her to hide it. Her response is to say, fine, I'll be cold, but I won't mind. She doesn't reject the management protocol's premise that her power is dangerous and isolating. She just rejects the part where she pretends to be warm. That's not liberation. That's accepting the diagnosis while refusing the treatment. The diagnosis, in this case, being, you are dangerous and you should not be near people. Fixer-upper, the most damning scene. Nobody talks about. The trolls return in Act 3 for a scene that is played as comedy, a rollicking, affectionate musical number in which the trolls try to set up Anna and Kristoff by cataloging Kristoff's faults and insisting that love can fix them. It's charming, it's funny, it fits perfectly with the film's broader comedic register. It is also the scene that, in the context of this thesis, functions as a second assault on the film's protagonist. The trolls who prescribed conceal, don't feel, to a frightened child are now prescribing fixer-upper to a frightened adult. The logic is identical. The person in front of them, Kristoff, this time, has qualities that don't fit the social norm. The prescribed solution is not to accommodate those qualities, not to find a world that fits the person, but to identify the person as a problem to be fixed through love. People don't really change, they cheerfully acknowledge, but love is a force that's strong and strange. Translation: the goal of love is not to accept a person as they are. The goal of love is to create conditions under which a person becomes more socially acceptable. This is the trolls' philosophy, applied now to the film's romantic arc. They were wrong about Elsa. Their prescription for her created the catastrophe the entire film spends 2 hours addressing. And they are being wrong again, right now, in a song that everyone treats as a cute comedic interlude rather than the ideological recurrence it actually is. But the song also does something else. Notice what the trolls are doing in this scene more broadly. They are, once again, making decisions for others. They are rushing Anna and Kristoff into a wedding before they've even agreed to a relationship. They are mobilizing as a community to impose a social outcome on individuals who haven't requested it. The language of love and warmth and family is being used to pressure people into conformity with the trolls' preferred social arrangement. The trolls are not villains in the sense that they want to harm anyone. They are villains in the sense that they have a philosophy about how people should exist in the world, and that philosophy consistently overrides the autonomy of the people they claim to love. They are, to use the clinical term, well-intentioned agents of coercive control. The ending skating rink, How to Build a Beautiful Prison. Here is the film's final image of Elsa. She has thawed Arendelle, embraced Anna, sent Hans packing, opened the castle gates, and now, in the film's closing sequence, she creates an ice skating rink in the castle courtyard for the people of Arendelle to enjoy. She skates with Anna. The people of Arendelle cheer. The gates are open. The gloves are off. The music swells. The gates are open. But let's be precise about what this means. The gates were closed for years, closed by the management protocol. Now they are open. That is genuine change, and it matters. The people of Arendelle can now interact with their queen. The queen can now use her powers publicly and joyfully, at least in this specific controlled context. In this specific controlled context, the skating rink is not Arendelle opening to Elsa's powers. It is Elsa's powers being channeled into a socially useful and aesthetically delightful performance for the pleasure of the assembled population. The ice is still being managed. It has just been transferred from the management of suppression to the management of performance. Elsa is no longer hiding her powers. She is deploying them on behalf of public entertainment in a space that the crowd has gathered to appreciate, in a form that is beautiful and non-threatening and unambiguously positive in its social effects. What happens if Elsa has a bad day? What happens if Elsa is frightened or furious or heartbroken? What happens if Elsa's powers, still inextricably linked to her emotional states, produce ice that is inconvenient rather than festive? The film doesn't address this. It ends on the good day, on the managed day, on the day when the powers and the emotions and the social expectations all align perfectly. It ends, in other words, on the same logical basis as the management protocol, except the management tool has changed from suppression to performance. Elsa still has to calibrate her emotional expression against its social consequences. She still has to ensure that her interior life produces publicly acceptable outputs. The gloves are off, but the audience is still watching. The thesis, Frozen's happy ending, is not the end of Elsa's managed existence. It is the upgrade of her management protocol. She has traded a strategy that required her to feel nothing for a strategy that requires her to feel the right things in the right ways at the right times. She has not been liberated. She has been promoted to a better cage. The obvious objection to everything I've just argued is probably forming in your head right now. You're probably thinking, but Let It Go actually helped people, real people, queer teenagers, autistic kids, people in recovery from abuse. You can't argue that its cultural impact was negative or misguided, because that impact was real and it was good. And look, this objection has genuine force. Let me state it as strongly as it deserves to be stated. Let It Go reached people. Not metaphorically, it reached people in specific, documented, measurable ways. NPR reported in 2019 on communities of disabled people, LGBTQ+ individuals, and people with eating disorders who found in the song something they had never found anywhere else in mainstream entertainment, a mirror for the experience of carrying something that the world insisted you hide. The song's cultural co-optation, taken out of its narrative context and used as a personal anthem, produced genuine solace for people who needed it. Kristen Lopez, one of the song's composers, has explicitly said that anyone carrying a secret shame that gets so heavy that they really can't carry it anymore is the song's intended audience. There's some truth to this. Hell, even the songwriters themselves told you what the song is about. Why would you argue against them? Here's why. Because the songwriters are describing what the song means in isolation, as a human document about shame and relief and the desire to stop performing normalcy. And in isolation, as a human document, the song is about exactly what they say it is. But the song does not exist in isolation. It exists within a film. And within that film, the specific experience the song depicts, the relief of no longer suppressing, the joy of finally showing yourself, is presented as insufficient, as the beginning of a problem, not the end of one, as the moment before Elsa accidentally triggers eternal winter and nearly kills her sister. The culture took "Let It Go" out of the film and said, "This is liberation." The film says this is the crisis point. The culture was finding something true in the song about the experience of shame and relief. The film was saying something different about what comes next, that revelation without integration, that exposure without support, that the decision to stop hiding without the development of tools to live with your difference. These are not sufficient. These produce ice palaces on lonely mountains. These produce self-exile. These produce beautiful, elaborate, solitary structures that keep you safe from the world by keeping you away from it. The appropriation of the song as liberation anthem is not wrong about what shame relief feels like. It's wrong, or rather incomplete, about what comes after. And the incompleteness is the problem. Because if "Let It Go" functions as a message that the relief itself is the destination, then the people the song most helped are people being told that the moment of revelation is where the work ends, not where it begins. Second objection. But Elsa, I is the hero. She saves everyone at the climax. You're probably thinking, wait though, doesn't Elsa thaw the kingdom? Doesn't she save Anna? Doesn't the film's climax show her using her powers heroically, decisively, without fear? Doesn't she end the film as a free, empowered queen who has learned to control her abilities? Isn't she the hero of her own story? Critics argue this, and they're half right. Elsa is definitely the protagonist. Her arc is the film's central emotional through line. And the thawing of Arendelle is her doing. It is genuinely hers. But here's what that interpretation overlooks, what unlocks Elsa's ability to thaw the kingdom. It is not self-knowledge. It is not therapeutic insight. It is not the development of a new relationship with her own powers. It is grief. Specifically, the sight of Anna apparently dead, and the mechanism by which grief unlocks her powers is never explained within the film's own logic. She has spent years being told that emotional intensity creates ice. At the moment of maximum emotional intensity, she thaws everything. The film resolves its central magical problem, not through coherent internal logic, but through emotional catharsis, which works beautifully as cinema and means essentially nothing as a system for how Elsa's powers actually function. What Elsa learns at the film's climax is that love thaws. She does not learn how to live with her powers day to day. She does not develop tools for managing her emotional states in ways that prevent the accidental freezing of people. She does not build systems or relationships or understanding. She has an emotional revelation, which produces a miraculous transformation, which resolves the external crisis. And then the film ends. The hero who saves everyone at the climax is not the same as the person whose underlying condition has been healed. Elsa's heroic act is real. Elsa's underlying situation, a person whose emotional life was systematically suppressed in childhood and who has not yet developed the self-knowledge or the relational infrastructure to integrate her authentic experience, is not resolved by the miracle of thawing. The film ends before that work begins. Third objection. The trolls were trying to help. Coercive control requires intent to control. This is probably the sharpest objection. Coercive control as a clinical and legal concept has historically been defined partly in terms of intention, the deliberate use of psychological strategies to limit someone's autonomy. Grandpappy is not trying to harm Elsa. The king is not trying to harm Elsa. They are frightened by circumstances they don't understand and prescribing the best solution available to them. Calling them agents of coercive control feels like assigning malice to ignorance. However, and contemporary research in coercive control trauma is unambiguous about this. Coercive control is defined by its effects on the subject's autonomy and identity, not solely by the controller's intentions. A person whose independence is systematically restricted, whose identity is managed through environmental control, whose emotional expression is suppressed as a condition of safety. That person is experiencing coercive control regardless of whether the people implementing it love them. The film knows this. It does not let the trolls off the hook in the way that critics do. It documents, scene by scene, the consequences of the troll's prescription. It shows us the door that doesn't open. It shows us the coronation panic attack. It shows us the ice palace avoidance architecture. It shows us the film's inciting catastrophe, eternal winter, which is the direct consequence of a management protocol that had no viable endgame. The trolls prescribed indefinite suppression. Indefinite suppression failed. The film puts that sequence on screen. It is not ambiguous. What the film does not do is name the trolls as wrong. It does not have a scene where someone explicitly confronts Grandpappy's prescription and identifies it as the source of the problem. And that absence, that refusal to name the mechanism, is the film's great elision. It shows us the harm. It doesn't indict the harm. It allows viewers to experience the damage as a series of sad events rather than as the predictable consequence of a specific, identifiable, critiquable system. Fourth objection. It's a children's movie. Stop overanalyzing. The "it's just a children's movie" argument is always the last line of defense for people who don't want to engage with what a piece of children's entertainment is actually teaching. I understand the impulse. It feels like I'm being pedantic about a Disney film aimed at 8-year-olds, applying frameworks that the filmmakers didn't intend and that children in the audience certainly don't bring. Two responses. First, intentionality does not determine cultural effect. Frozen reached the children who watched it with a particular story about difference, about the response to difference, about what liberation looks like, and about what constitutes a happy ending. Those children absorbed those stories. What they absorb from Let It Go. The idea that the relief of no longer hiding is itself the destination, without the harder work of integration, is a thing they absorbed regardless of whether anyone intended to teach it. Second, the children's movie defense treats children as categorically different from the people they will become, rather than as developing humans whose primary modeling environment is culture. The children who watched Frozen in 2013 are in their late 20s and early 30s now. The stories they were told about difference and concealment and liberation when they were 8 are part of the architecture of how they understand those experiences as adults. That's not overanalysis. That's how developmental psychology works. Frozen was released on November 27, 2013. Let's situate that. 2013 was the year the United States Supreme Court struck down Section 3 of the Defense of Marriage Act in United States v. Windsor, opening the path toward marriage equality and representing the most significant legal acknowledgement in American history that queer people's relationships deserved public recognition. It was also the year that saw the peak cultural circulation of the It Gets Better campaign. Dan Savage's 2010 initiative had spent 3 years accumulating hundreds of thousands of video testimonials from LGBTQ+ adults, assuring queer youth that the pain of concealment, rejection, and isolation would eventually end. In other words, Frozen arrived at a cultural moment when the central question animating its narrative, what happens to people who are forced to hide what they are, was also the central question animating one of the most significant civil rights conversations of the 21st century. The timing was not incidental. Whether the filmmakers consciously engineered it or not, Frozen arrived into a culture desperate for stories about managed identity and its costs, and it was received with the emotional intensity that desperate reception produces. The LGBTQ+ reading of Elsa is, for these reasons, both understandable and slightly wrong. It is understandable because Elsa's story maps onto the experience of closeting with alarming precision, the secret self, the performance of normalcy for family and society, the way ordinary social situations become minefields of potential exposure, the isolation that results, the catastrophic reveal. All of this resonates because it is all true of both the film and the closet experience. The reading is doing real emotional work for real people. But it is slightly wrong because the reading adopts the film's compressed narrative logic. Elsa hides, Elsa reveals, Elsa is accepted as a template for liberation. When the film is actually doing something more structurally honest and more disturbing, it is documenting the damage caused by hiding without being able to propose a fully coherent model of what comes after. Elsa at the film's end is not post-closet in any meaningful therapeutic sense. She is post-hiding, but the conditions that made hiding seem necessary have not been adequately addressed. The world now knows about her powers. The world has, at the end of the film, responded with enthusiasm rather than rejection. But Elsa's interior life, her capacity for trust, her learned association between emotional intensity and catastrophe, her framework for herself as a danger that needs to be managed, none of that has been engaged in the film's emotional resolution. The It Gets Better campaign has faced versions of this critique as well. The promise that it gets better, that the suffering of concealment ends when concealment ends, is consoling and necessary. It is also, as critics of the campaign have argued, incomplete. It addresses the external conditions of rejection without adequately grappling with the internal damage done by years of managing a secret self. You can come out of the closet and the external rejection can diminish, and you can still spend years rebuilding a self that was dismantled during the years of hiding. Better can describe a changed circumstance while a person is still internally not yet free. Frozen, despite itself, almost against its own narrative intentions, maps this more honest version of the story. Elsa's changed circumstances are real. Her internal architecture is unaddressed. The film ends on the changed circumstances and does not look at what still needs doing. The Let It Go industrial complex. Something happened to Let It Go between November 2013 and approximately spring 2014 that is itself a phenomenon worth analyzing. The song escaped the film. This is not unusual for Disney animation. A Whole New World, Circle of Life, Be Our Guest. These songs have cultural existences independent of the films that produced them. But Let It Go escaped its film in a specific way that the others didn't. It escaped the film's context completely. The other breakout Disney songs are functional as standalone pieces because they are essentially celebratory. They work as pure expressions of joy or wonder that don't depend on narrative context for their impact. Let It Go requires narrative context to be fully legible. Without the context, it sounds like a liberation anthem. With the context, it is a person fleeing a crisis into a beautiful but inadequate solution. By early 2014, Let It Go had been separated from its context so thoroughly that most people who sang it had flattened it into its apparent message. Be yourself, reject shame, embrace your difference without the film's complicating evidence available. The song was being used as an empowerment tool while the film it came from was arguing, quietly, that the feeling the song describes is the beginning of a longer and harder process. Disney, it should be noted, did nothing to correct this. Why would they? The misreading was commercially valuable. A liberation anthem generates merchandise, theme park attendance, and cultural longevity. A trauma narrative, however precisely rendered, does not sell ice castles and Elsa costumes to the same degree. The industrial apparatus surrounding Frozen had every incentive to amplify the liberation reading and no incentive to amplify the diagnostic one. And so the song was stripped of its context, packaged as empowerment, and deployed across every possible cultural surface. Karaoke, school performances, political rallies, coming out videos, viral social media moments. The film from which it came became, for many of its most devoted fans, essentially beside the point. Let It Go became the film, which meant that the film's actual argument, the precise, uncomfortable, clinically accurate portrait of what coercive identity suppression produces and what it fails to resolve, was available only to people who were watching closely, which is to say, almost nobody. Attachment theory and what Frozen actually modeled. The developmental psychology framework most relevant to Frozen is attachment theory, specifically the concept of anxious attachment and its relationship to emotional suppression in childhood. Attachment theory, developed initially by John Bowlby and expanded by Mary Ainsworth and subsequent researchers, holds that children develop their primary emotional regulation strategies in response to their primary caregivers' responsiveness. Children who have consistent, responsive caregivers develop what's called secure attachment. They learn that expressing emotional needs produces care, which means they can afford to have emotional needs. Children whose caregivers are inconsistent, unavailable, or distressed by their emotional expression develop various forms of insecure attachment. The specific form most relevant to Elsa is called avoidant attachment. Children who learn through repeated experience that expressing emotional needs causes problems for the caregiver, for the relationship, for the child themselves, develop strategies for suppressing those needs. They learn to seem self-sufficient. They learn to not ask for what they need. They learn, in the language of Frozen's own songs, to conceal, not feel, not let it show. Avoidant attachment does not produce cold, unfeeling people. It produces people with intense interior emotional lives and minimal capacity to express those emotions in relational contexts. Research consistently shows that people with avoidant attachment strategies have the same internal physiological responses to emotional stimuli as secure attachment individuals. Their hearts race, their cortisol spikes, their emotional experience is as intense as anyone's, but their external behavior suppresses the expression of those states. They do not feel less. They perform less. They perform less. This is Elsa. To a clinical degree of precision, this is Elsa. Her powers are not a metaphor for homosexuality alone, or for neurodivergence alone, or for any single specific form of difference. They are a metaphor for the interior emotional life of a person with avoidant attachment, powerful, involuntary, and managed through performance of non-feeling. And the management protocol the trolls prescribe is not, incidentally, a metaphor for suppression. It is suppression, stated explicitly in the film's own lyrics, the empowerment washing of suffering. Frozen belongs to a category of cultural products that has become increasingly prevalent since the early 2010s. Stories about suffering that are packaged and received as stories about triumph. The suffering is depicted accurately enough to feel authentic to people who have experienced it. The triumph is sketched broadly enough to feel emotionally satisfying without requiring the story to engage with what healing actually demands. The gap between the accurate depiction of suffering and the broad sketch of resolution is where the cultural misreading lives. This category, call it empowerment washing, is not unique to children entertainment. It runs through a specific vein of mainstream cinema and television that emerged around the same cultural moment as Frozen, the era of what we might call inspirational suffering, in which experiences of trauma, marginalization, and identity suppression are portrayed with enough authenticity to feel validating, but resolved with enough emotional efficiency to feel uplifting rather than demanding. The suffering is the hook. The resolution is the product. The distance between them, the hard, slow, unglamorous work of actually reintegrating a suppressed self, is the thing that gets cut. Think about what this pattern does to its audiences. It tells people who have experienced genuine damage, coercive identity suppression, childhood emotional neglect, the violence of enforced normalcy, that the resolution to that damage is available through an emotional breakthrough. That love, specifically, is the mechanism. That the moment you stop performing your managed self and allow yourself to feel, the crisis resolves. The Arendellian winter thaws. The kingdom celebrates. The gloves come off. What this leaves out is everything a therapist, a developmental psychologist, or anyone who has actually done the work of rebuilding a suppressed self would tell you, that breakthroughs feel like breakthroughs, but they are the beginning of a process, not the end of one. That the damage done by years of concealment does not lift with the concealment. That learning to trust, to express, to integrate, to exist in relationship as a full self rather than a managed performance. This takes time, takes support, takes the kind of patient, non-spectacular work that doesn't make good cinema. Frozen shows you the breakthrough. It does not have time for what comes after. And in showing only the breakthrough, it inadvertently teaches its audience, particularly the young, particularly the people most in need of this story, that the breakthrough is sufficient, that let it go is the end, not the beginning. The comparison that haunts Frozen, Rapunzel, and Ariel Frozen is frequently praised as a departure from earlier Disney princess narratives, specifically from stories like The Little Mermaid, 1989, and Tangled, 2010, in which female protagonists are defined largely by their relationships with male characters. And it is a departure, genuinely. Anna and Elsa's relationship is the film's center. The male characters are secondary or antagonistic. But consider Tangled, the film immediately preceding Frozen in the Disney canon, with the thesis of this essay in mind. Rapunzel, like Elsa, has a special power, her hair's healing magic, that is used by an authority figure, Mother Gothel, as a justification for isolation and control. Rapunzel, like Elsa, is kept away from the world, kept away from other people, told that her safety depends on her confinement. And Rapunzel's liberation, her actual escape from the tower, is unambiguous. She leaves, she enters the world. She does not build herself a more beautiful tower on a higher mountain. She goes to the lanterns, to the city, to Flynn, to the life she was kept from. Tangled knows that its management story requires the protagonist to actually break out of the management system, not just exchange one management system for a prettier one. Frozen, in its final sequence, does not quite achieve this. Elsa's resolution is real but partial. She exits the total isolation of the ice palace and enters the managed visibility of the skating rink performance. That's movement. But it's not Rapunzel leaving the tower. Consider also The Little Mermaid, which is endlessly criticized, rightly in many respects, for its narrative of a young woman who literally gives up her voice to pursue a man. But examine that film's structure and you find something that Frozen doesn't quite have. Ariel's desire is absolutely unapologetically her own. She knows what she wants. She pursues it with determination that the film doesn't attempt to complicate or pathologize. She is impulsive, and she makes bad choices, and her father disapproves. And the film, finally, stands with her desires rather than with the authority that sought to suppress them. Her father is wrong. Ariel is, within the film's terms, right? Frozen is too sophisticated to offer this clarity. It cannot say, Elsa's instincts are right and the management protocol is wrong. It can only show the damage the management protocol caused and allow love to stand in the gap where clarity should be. That sophistication is part of what makes Frozen a more interesting film than most critics give it credit for. It is also part of what makes its resolution feel, on reflection, slightly insufficient. The legacy problem, Frozen 2, and the uncorrected wound, Frozen 2, 2019, was, in part, an attempt to address what the original film left unresolved. In the sequel, Elsa is called toward a mystery, a voice only she can hear, a destination only she can reach, and she ultimately discovers that she is the fifth spirit of nature, a being whose fundamental identity is not person with a dangerous difference, but elemental force with a cosmological role. She doesn't belong in Arendelle. She belongs in the enchanted forest, in the unknown, in the world beyond the castle gates. Critics and audiences were divided on this resolution. Some found it liberating, others found it confusing. But in the context of this essay's thesis, the sequel's resolution is fascinating. It retroactively acknowledges that the original film's ending was insufficient. Elsa at the skating rink was not the end of her story because the skating rink was still a performance for others. The sequel argues that Elsa's authentic home is not a managed space, but a genuinely different world, one where her nature is not a deviation from the norm, but the norm itself. This is a bolder resolution than the original offered, and it's telling that Disney needed a second film to get there. The first film brought Elsa to the threshold of authentic self-knowledge and then retreated to the skating rink. The sequel pushed through that threshold. The fact that it took a sequel to complete the argument is itself evidence that the original's happy ending was always incomplete, a feel-good stopping point rather than a genuine resolution. Here is the test for any interpretation. Does the craft of the film support it? Not just the narrative, not just the thematic logic, but the specific technical choices, camera, color, music, editing, performance, that a film deploys to produce its effects. If Frozen is a trauma narrative, its craft should be encoding that argument in the language of filmmaking. It should be visible in the choices that directors Chris Buck and Jennifer Lee made, in the way cinematographer, or more accurately, the digital image designer, built this world, in the specific decisions that went into the film's visual and musical architecture. It is, extensively, the color palette. Blue has always been the film's prison. The most discussed visual element of Frozen is Elsa's blue and white color palette, her ice palace, her powers, the eternal winter she accidentally creates. Critics have read this as a visual representation of her magical identity, of her cold exterior concealing warmth within, of the beauty of her authentic self. And on that surface level, these readings are partially correct. But follow the blue more carefully. Blue in Frozen is not merely Elsa's color. Blue is the color of the management protocol. It is the color of enclosure, of cold, of the aesthetic of suppression rendered beautiful. Anna is warm, oranges, greens, lavenders. Arendelle, in its pre-frozen state, is warm. The trolls are warm earth tones. Kristoff is warm, brown fur, golden firelight. Hans, and this is interesting, is initially coded warm, which is why Anna trusts him immediately and why his betrayal is shocking. He presents in warm colors that turn out to be a performance. Elsa is always blue. Even before the film establishes her isolation, she is blue. Even as a happy young child playing with Anna in the opening sequence, she is dressed in cool blues and silvers against Anna's warm palette. The film is not just using color to distinguish sisters. It is encoding Elsa's difference, her managed separateness, into her visual identity from the film's earliest frames. Now watch what happens to the color palette during Let It Go. The sequence is visually stunning, one of the most technically accomplished animated sequences of the decade, and it is almost entirely blue and white. The color that is represented in closure and management throughout the film, the color of Elsa's isolation, is now the color of her supposed liberation. She is building her palace of freedom entirely out of the aesthetic of her prison. This is not an accident. The film's visual system is telling you something the narrative has been asked to tell differently. Elsa's liberation is constructed from the same material as her suppression. She has not escaped the management protocol's aesthetic. She has decorated it. She has made it beautiful. She has moved into it voluntarily. But the blue has not changed. Compare this to the film's final sequence, the skating rink. What color is the ice Elsa creates for Arendelle's celebration? Blue and white. What color are the decorations, the patterns, the snowflakes she generates? Blue and white. The warm world of Arendelle momentarily takes on Elsa's palette, or rather, Elsa's palette is briefly admitted into Arendelle's warm world on the occasion of a controlled celebratory performance. But the world does not change its fundamental warmth, and Elsa does not change her fundamental blue. They coexist for the length of the skating sequence, and then the film ends. The warm world did not become Elsa's. Elsa was not absorbed into the warm world. They were adjacent for a moment on managed terms, and then the credits rolled. The locked door as visual grammar, I counted the doors in Frozen. Specifically, I tracked every appearance of a closed, locked, or shut door as a compositional element, not just as a plot device, but as a visual choice. The castle gates close during the opening act after the troll scene. First enclosure, first formal establishment of the management space. Anna knocks on Elsa's door during the film's most emotionally devastating sequence, and Elsa's door never opens, the management protocol rendered as domestic architecture. At the coronation, the gates of Arendelle open. The film treats this as liberation, and it is the only scene where open doors are presented as straightforwardly positive. When the coronation goes wrong, Elsa flees. She does not close the door behind her, but she does not leave one open either. She simply runs. Then comes the Ice Palace sequence. After all that has been established about doors as the visual grammar of enclosure and management, watch what Elsa does at the end of Let It Go. She opens the door to her palace, steps inside, and turns around. She looks back at the mountain she's climbed, at the world she's fled, and then she closes the door. It is the film's most precise visual argument. At the moment supposedly representing liberation, the film's dominant visual motif of enclosure reappears. The door closes. Not slammed, not locked, closed with finality, with satisfaction, as if finally having a door she controls is itself the freedom she sought. And it is freedom of a kind. She controls this door. She built this door. Nobody can open this door without her permission. For a person who spent her entire life on the inside of a door she didn't choose, having a door she controls is genuine change. I do not want to dismiss it. But a chosen enclosure is still enclosure. The Ice Palace door is a better cage than the one she left. It is still a cage. The music is clinical text. What the lyrics say versus what the melody makes you hear. The musical architecture of Frozen is probably its most sophisticated argument, encoding mechanism, and it operates primarily through the gap between what the melodies make you feel and what the lyrics actually say. The most telling example is not Let It Go. It is the song that answers Let It Go, the song that plays in the same key with the same musical DNA later in the film. The reprise of For the First Time in Forever, sung as a duet between Anna and Elsa at the Ice Palace, has a musical structure almost identical to the triumphant solos, but its lyrical content is a direct confrontation between the management protocol, Elsa's voice, and the desire for authentic connection, Anna's voice. Anna is singing musically, the same emotional register as Let It Go, expansive, hopeful, reaching. Elsa is singing the suppression protocol in the same musical register. The film puts liberation and suppression to the same music, which is a sophisticated and deeply uncomfortable choice. It forces you to feel the emotional weight of the management protocol, to hear how seductive suppression sounds when it is sung with conviction. The music does not editorialize. It does not tell you that Elsa is wrong and Anna is right. It presents both voices as equally emotionally compelling, which is precisely the experience of someone navigating the space between authentic desire and the voice of a deeply internalized management protocol. Both voices feel real. Both voices feel urgent. The conflict is not between wrong and right. It is between two versions of reality that cannot yet coexist. The performance. Idina Menzel's voice as evident. There is a specific moment in Idina Menzel's vocal performance of Let It Go that has always been identified as the song's triumphant peak, the high, sustained note on Stand in the bridge. It is indeed extraordinary, but I want to talk about a different moment. The cold never bothered me anyway. The final line. The kicker. Delivered piano after the orchestral swell has subsided. Listen to Menzel's inflection on anyway. There is something in it, An almost imperceptible tightening, a micro quality of defiance rather than confidence, of assertion rather than statement. That sounds, if you're listening for it, less like a woman who has made peace with her nature and more like a woman who has decided firmly to stop acknowledging the thing that hurts. The cold never bothered me anyway is not the same as the cold is my gift and I love it. It is the statement of a person who has decided to dissociate from a source of pain by reassigning it as a source of pride. These are different operations. The first is integration. The second is rebranding. Menzel's delivery captures this distinction with extraordinary subtlety, and it is the kind of performance detail that is invisible unless you are already asking the question this essay asks. Fixer-Upper, the Troll song as thesis statement. The Trolls Act 3 musical number, Fixer-Upper, is generally treated as a comedic sequence, light relief before the film's climactic emotional turn. Look at it as craft, and it is something else, a second issuance of the management protocol now applied to the film's romantic plot. The songwriting structure is deliberate. The Trolls catalog Kristoff's faults: socially awkward, overly friendly with reindeer, various personal hygiene issues, and offer the prescription, love will fix him. The melody is bouncy, the harmonies warm, the performance energetic and comedic, and embedded in that warmth and comedy is an ideology. The faults they catalog are not deep faults, but they are faults, and love is prescribed not as the acceptance of those faults, but as the mechanism for their eventual correction. People make bad choices when they're mad or scared or stressed. Throw a little love their way and you'll bring out their best. True love brings out their best. This is not acceptance. This is a conditional relationship offer. Love you, get your best, implied that the parts of you that are not your best are temporary states to be managed. The Trolls are, in this song, prescribing a version of the same managed identity they prescribed to Elsa in Act 1, except now the prescribed management tool is romantic love rather than emotional suppression. The framework is identical. The authentic, complex, sometimes inconvenient self is something to be worked on, improved, brought to its best version. The messy parts are not to be integrated but corrected. The craft choice here is to put this ideology in a joyful, warm, comedic musical number to make it maximally appealing and minimally interrogable. You cannot critique Fixer-Upper in the moment of watching it because the moment of watching it is too fun. The film has weaponized its own warmth against its own deepest argument. The director's blind spot, Jennifer Lee and Chris Buck, made a film that, in its technical choices, is more honest than its narrative allows itself to be. The color system tells the truth. The door motif tells the truth. Menzel's performance tells the truth. The lyrical content, stripped of melody, tells the truth. What the film cannot quite do, what it is structurally prevented from doing by its genre, family animation, and its industrial context, Disney, is let the truth it is depicting arrive at the conclusion that truth deserves. The film cannot say the Trolls were wrong and here is why and here is what a different choice would have looked like. The film cannot say Elsa's resolution is incomplete and here's what she still needs. The film cannot say the skating rink is not enough. The craft is arguing all of these things quietly through the accumulated weight of closed doors and blue palettes and unresolved performance notes. But the narrative overrides the craft at every resolution point and delivers the feel-good outcome. What you're left with is a film at war with itself, in which the technical language is more truthful than the story it's telling. And that war is most visible, most precisely dramatized in the gap between the triumphant orchestration of "Let It Go" and the resigned resignation of its final line. Let's be honest about what we did. When Frozen arrived, we had a choice. Not a conscious choice. Nobody sat down and decided to misread a film. But we made a choice nonetheless. In the aggregate, through the mechanism of cultural reception, we looked at a story about a person whose authentic self had been systematically suppressed by the people who loved her, who had spent her formative years executing a management protocol that required her to perform non-feeling, whose liberation was structurally a crisis. rather than a triumph, whose resolution was incomplete and managed rather than free and genuine. And we called it a liberation story. We did this because the alternative was uncomfortable. The alternative was sitting with what Frozen actually depicts, the specific, precise, recognizable experience of being someone who was taught in childhood that the parts of yourself that made other people uncomfortable needed to be hidden, not for your sake, for theirs. The alternative was acknowledging that the management protocol is not exceptional, not something that only happens in magical kingdoms to special ice queens, but ordinary, ubiquitous, that it happens in every family where a child's emotional intensity is treated as a problem to be managed rather than an experience to be integrated. That it happens in every culture that responds to difference with a management prescription rather than an accommodation framework. That it happened to many of the people sitting in the theater who are now parents of the children currently watching. The liberation reading of Frozen was not wrong. It was protective. It allowed audiences to receive the film's emotional truth, the precise, painful accuracy of its suppression portrait, without having to sit with the full weight of what that portrait indicts. If Let It Go is liberation, then the film ends in triumph and we can sing along with the triumph. If Let It Go is the sound of a pressure vessel cracking, then the film ends in managed partial resolution, and we have to reckon with what was never resolved. We chose the triumph. Of course we did. What the film would look like if it were actually about liberation. Here is a thought experiment. What would Frozen look like if it were genuinely, structurally, narratively committed to the liberation it is credited with depicting? It would, at some point, have a scene in which an authority figure acknowledges that the management protocol was wrong, not it came from love, which is true and which the film does establish, but wrong. Grandpappy would need a scene where he looks at what his prescription produced and says, I prescribed the wrong thing. The king, before his death, would need a scene where he questions his own strategy. One of these reckonings would need to happen on screen, explicitly, because without it, the film can mourn the consequences of the protocol without indicting the protocol itself. A genuinely liberation-structured Frozen would also need Elsa to develop a relationship with her powers that is not structured around their social utility. The skating rink is Elsa performing her powers for the enjoyment of others. A liberation ending would show Elsa using her powers for herself, in private, not for an audience, not producing something others can enjoy, but simply because her powers are hers, and she is entitled to inhabit them without managing their social impact. The film never shows us this. Every scene in which Elsa uses her powers has either a traumatic or performed quality. She never simply is. And a genuinely liberation-structured Frozen would need to show us a scene in which Elsa is frightened or angry or overwhelmed, post-resolution after the skating rink, and the people around her respond with accommodation rather than expectation. Because the real test of liberation is not whether things are fine on the good days. It is what happens on the bad one. The film ends on a good day and never makes that promise. These absences are not plot holes. They are structural honesty. Frozen is not a liberation story. It is a damage story that stops at the threshold of liberation and calls the threshold the destination. What it reveals about us as an audience. The cultural misreading of Frozen is not an embarrassing failure of critical acuity. It is an extremely human response to difficult material. We wanted liberation for Elsa because many of us needed a story about liberation for our own reasons. We found it in the music, which is genuinely liberatory in its emotional register, genuinely cathartic, genuinely powerful in the way that only music that captures something true about emotional release can be. And we allowed the music to override the narrative's more complex argument. This is what songs do. They are more emotionally direct than narrative. They create feeling in the body that bypasses the mind's analysis. Let It Go feels like liberation in the moment of hearing it, and that feeling is not an illusion. It is a real emotional experience that the song produces reliably across millions of listeners. The illusion is the inference from the feeling to the narrative, because this feels like liberation. The story it comes from is a liberation story. It isn't. The story it comes from is a damage story. The song's emotional power is real because the damage it comes from is real, because the experience of a pressure vessel cracking after years of suppression is genuinely cathartic in the moment, genuinely liberatory in the moment, regardless of what it costs and what it leaves unresolved. The song is truthful about the feeling. The narrative is truthful about what the feeling fails to address. We kept the first truth and set down the second, the legacy we should inherit. Instead, if you accept this reading, and I understand if you don't, or if you're holding it in tension with the liberation reading, which I think is the most honest position, then what do you do with it? Not decide that Frozen is a bad film. It isn't. It is a remarkably honest film about something genuinely difficult, and its honesty is encoded in its technical choices with real sophistication. The directors made something more complex and more truthful than the culture allowed it to be. Not decide that Let It Go is a bad song or that its use as a liberation anthem was harmful. The real-world impact of the song on people carrying genuine shame and pain was real and was good, and no film critical argument changes that. What you should do instead is this: grant Frozen the complexity it actually earned. Acknowledge that it depicted a management protocol and its consequences with diagnostic accuracy. Acknowledge that its resolution is partial rather than complete, and that the partiality is honest, not a flaw. Acknowledge that the skating rink is not the end of Elsa's story, and that the film, in its craft, if not in its narrative, seems to know this. And then, more importantly, carry the film's actual argument forward into the conversations it was always, obliquely, about what we do to children who are different, about the difference between managing difference and accommodating it, about the management protocols that well-meaning authority figures install in children who need development instead of suppression, about what those children become when the protocols fail, about the gap, vast, difficult, largely undiscussed, between the moment of revelation and the state of freedom, about what it gets better, leaves out, about the work that happens after Let It Go stops playing. The provocation that should follow you out of this, here is the question I want to leave you with, and it is not a rhetorical question, it is a real one. When you hear Let It Go now, and you will hear it again, it isn't going anywhere. What are you hearing? If you're hearing triumph, you're hearing the melody. If you're hearing the crisis that the melody is carrying, you're hearing the film. If you're holding both, the genuine catharsis of no longer hiding and the genuine incompleteness of what comes after, you're hearing something closer to the truth that Frozen spent 102 minutes trying to tell you. The song is not wrong as an anthem. The people who used it as an anthem were not wrong. The trolls were wrong. The management protocol was wrong. The instruction to a terrified child that the solution to being different is to perform sameness indefinitely and alone without support. That was wrong. The film knows it was wrong. It built its entire narrative around the evidence of its wrongness. It just couldn't quite bring itself to say so directly. So let me say it directly on the film's behalf. Elsa was not broken. She was managed. The management broke her. The love that fixed it was real, but it was not sufficient. And the part that wasn't sufficient, the work that still needed doing at the end of the film, the therapy that wasn't available, the cultural accommodation that hadn't been built, the interior architecture that was still constructed around conceal, don't feel, even when the concealment policy was officially lifted, that part is not a detail you can edit out. That part is the film's truest and most urgent argument. Frozen is not a story about learning to be free. It is a story about learning what was done to you. The film stops before Elsa fully learns it. We stopped before the film fully taught it. We got the anthem and left the diagnosis on the table. The diagnosis is still there, and unlike the winter, it is not going to thaw on its own. Rewatch Frozen. Count the doors. Listen to the last line. Watch the color of the ice at the end. Ask yourself who built the skating rink and who it was built for, and whether you can call that freedom. Then ask yourself whether the song you've been singing for 12 years is a victory or a record of a wound. The answer changes everything about what comes next.